Welcome, colleagues. Welcome, speakers, to Walking the Talk, Embodied Pedagogies of Social Justice, our plenary session. It's traditional for an outgoing member of the SAA Executive Committee to introduce plenary panels. I'm very pleased to be introducing a panel that puts pedagogy teaching at the heart of research and the scholarly identity of Shakespeareans, and specifically inclusive pedagogy, to borrow a definition from Saunders and Cardia. Content and other course objectives are explicitly viewed from multiple perspectives and varied experiences of a range of groups, and help students understand how they construct knowledge in any field or discipline. As a leader of a liberal arts university, that focus is, to my mind, one of the most powerful engines of innovation in Shakespeare studies. And it's important that the SAA foreground it in the way that our speakers are doing today. The goal of our 5 papers is to present together a vision of the classroom as a critical space where scholarship gains meaning in respect to lived identity and location. Meaning in terms of intellectual significance, affective force, and social impact. The speakers have designed this panel intentionally to bring together scholar teachers from different situations, personal, geographic, institutional, and professional. The panel is designed to foreground the relationship between who and what we are and the same qualities of those that we teach. Their different positions and positionalities lead the presenters to explore pedagogical experiences and strategies related to 3 questions. The questions are, first, where we are, to create space for the different contours of social and national politics that students inhabit as part of their lived experiences that they bring into our learning spaces. How we feel, that is, attuning to passions and presumptions that students bring from their homes and communal spaces onto campus and into our classrooms as they respond to literary texts. And what we risk, the aspirations and limits on a teacher's ability to create learning communities where students can be intellectually and emotionally courageous and uncomfortable. Across these 5 presentations, you're going to hear different ways how communities are crucial, hear in different ways how communities are crucial to teaching in a socially just way. Our scholarly communities like the SAA, our classroom communities, and also the communities of practice that we convene like this panel. These speakers invite you into the idea that what makes it possible for teacher scholars to walk the talk is walking together. With that in mind, they've designed a presentation format that takes advantage of the remote platform we are using today, blending classic and new aspects of SAA presentations. Many SAA colleagues know me as a technophile. I do miss enormously being together with all of us at our conference, but I also find it incredibly exciting to explore this year what remote presentation can add to the SAA. We're going to learn a lot. For this panel, here's the game plan. The papers will be brief, 20 minutes, with no break in between. The speaker's aim is to open up conversation. Here's some ground rules we're testing out to balance the parts of the conversation. Papers are recorded in advance. The speakers at the end will be live, but will not be responding to chat during the video presentations. We aim to keep everyone focused on all the voices here. Then we aim to use the chat after the presentations to invite you to capture your thoughts in real time, but not to interrupt your colleagues' papers in real time. So just hold your thoughts, type them up, and then just punch them into the chat, and the speakers will take turns managing the chat and questions as one does in Zoom. I'm going to give you 5 bios in order of presentation. Kirsten Mendoza has taught at the University of Dayton since August of 2018. She has contributed to the collection Teaching Social Justice Through Shakespeare, Why Renaissance Literature Matters Now, by Hilary Eklund and Wendy Beth Hyman, and has a forthcoming article on Renaissance drama on the racialization of consent. Whether she is teaching the survey of early modern courses, first semester writing seminars, or literature and human rights from the 16th century to the 21st, she and her students wrestle with Shakespeare in light of the topic of the specific seminar, and also the relation of their collective but varying views, ideas, and feelings about Shakespeare as a cultural icon. Mary Janelle Metzger has been teaching Shakespeare since 1988, first in Iowa, then in Mississippi, and for the balance of her career in Bellington, Washington. In each of these places, Shakespeare has had distinct connections to her students' lives and the cultural practices of their communities. She aims to localize and historicize the uses of Shakespeare and its potential meanings and appropriations for BIPOC and white students alike. That effort remains a crucible in the classroom, her department and university, and the community of secondary teachers that she works with. Eric L. de Barros is an assistant professor of English at Old Dominion University, right around the corner, Eric. His research centers on the politics of embodied subjectivity in early modern literary and educational texts. He has authored several articles on the topic, and his main book project, Shakespeare and the Pedagogy of Sexual Violence, Race, Class, and the Redefinition of Masculinity, will endeavor to rethink Shakespeare as an ethnically oriented educational theorist with much to teach us about how education reflects, shapes, and interrogates cultural norms. Marissa Greenberg has taught at least one section of Shakespeare almost every semester for 15 years. In 2016, she pivoted from the physical classroom to the virtual classroom and embraced the opportunities afforded by asynchronous teaching and learning environments to re-envision the Shakespeare curriculum in terms of access and inclusion. So prescient for the year that we've just passed through. Marissa and Elizabeth Williamson began a collaboration that has fundamentally changed the way Marissa teaches Shakespeare at the University of New Mexico, a majority-minority institution in a region with double colonial settler history. Elizabeth Williamson currently serves as Curriculum and Faculty Hiring Dean at the Evergreen State College. Prior to this appointment, she taught full-time, coordinated study programs at Evergreen for 15 years. Commitments to cultural relevance, theoretical rigor, transparency, and accessibility infuse her interdisciplinary pedagogy. When teaching Shakespeare, she believes strongly in providing students with classroom structures that deliberately address power imbalances. This is one of the core elements of the pedagogical tool she has been developing with Marissa Greenberg. So as you will hear, the presentations converge on the idea of partnership with students and among scholar teachers, classroom partnerships as the engine for innovation. I will adapt one of my favorite maxims learned from the scholar Layli Maparian, that research plus leadership equals accelerated social change. Today you will hear 5 distinguished colleagues share how teaching plus research focused on equity and justice accelerates learning and accelerates social change. Thank you.
Marissa and I want to begin by thanking you all for showing up for this conversation on social justice pedagogies. We're humbled by the work of our fellow panelists and glad to be here with all of you. So when we wrote that opening sentence early in 2020, we envisioned speaking it into a very different kind of room. As we reflect on the fact that we are sharing a virtual space with you instead of a physical one, we're reminded that there has always been a gap between mainstream Shakespeare studies and social justice. It is this uncomfortable history that motivates our research. Like many of you, Marissa and I work at institutions where students and colleagues are routinely targeted because of their identities, especially when those identities register as non-white or not straight. During the final year of Trump's presidency, we were ironically grateful that people we care about weren't having to face the possibility of being stalked in their physical classrooms. That said, for many of them, the mere act of appearing in public, let alone at a protest, still involves significant danger. In this context, making room for social justice pedagogy requires us to take seriously the ongoing threats to safety and well-being that impact our most vulnerable community members. It requires us to explore spaces where an intellectual, emotional, or professional risk can quickly escalate to the risk of bodily harm. As long as we carry our identities with us into our classrooms, neutrality is not an option for us or for those we teach. But as educators, we have the opportunity to be deliberate about how we set up those rooms, making sure that students are both encouraged and supported in their efforts to tackle difficult questions about what it means to pursue social justice. And this, in short, is what our paper is about. We're making a case for focusing not just on what we teach, but on the conditions in which learning happens.
In an influential reading of Paradise Lost, John Gillies argues that Milton uses the word room to designate neither space nor place, but the conditions governing embodied experience. The Miltonic Room, Gillies writes, is an environment with built-in predispositions that are alternatively cosmic, physical, metaphysical, moral, emotional, and spiritual. It is the sum of possibilities within which a given life form might thrive or wither. This conception of room allows us at once to bear witness to what's baked into the learning spaces in many of our institutions, even as it invites us to design rooms that temporarily disrupt those foundations. Indeed, according to Gillies' reading, room is a noun expressive of the material and immaterial circumstances of living, and a verb that designates potentially transformative experiences. What we find useful about this understanding of room is that it captures both students' individual, multifaceted embodiments and their interactions with a learning environment that, like the larger culture, tends toward oppression and exclusion.
In our collaborative effort to put rooming into practice, Marissa and I have been developing a pedagogical version of a facilitation structure called caucusing, a supportive discussion environment most often used within activist organizations and student support groups. In these contexts, a caucus is a temporary private gathering of members of the same historically oppressed population. Some anti-racist organizations also create caucuses for people who hold privilege in a particular aspect of their identity. In either case, the grouping is meant to draw out some shared affinity in order to build trust and confidence when speaking about highly charged topics. Caucusing as we practice it is one way of rooming, one part of our ongoing efforts to create learning environments that enable a diversity of students to thrive, not in spite of, but because of the plurality of the embodied identities they inhabit. Accordingly, we provide a rotating set of options for students based on anonymous positionality surveys. Each week, students choose which room they want to temporarily affiliate with. One week, for instance, students might choose between a transgender and non-binary caucus, a cisgender women caucus, and a cisgender men caucus. Another week, there might be caucuses designed around students' religious identities. As our research assistant Sylvia Chowdhury writes, the aim of caucusing is to provide students the chance to speak freely with others who share their lived experiences in order to better prepare them for conversations with others who may not. Caucusing does not create echo chambers, however, because within each room, students encounter differences that are typically erased in dominant culture spaces. This nuanced polyphony prepares students to engage with the more readily identifiable differences that emerge in class-wide dialogue.
We are happy to talk about the pragmatic steps that this pedagogy requires, from ensuring adequate enrollment in caucus groups, to navigating identities that don't fit neatly into a single category, to fostering self-managing discussions that deepen students' understanding of the text. At the moment, though, we want to jump to the end of the process and list some of the positive outcomes this pedagogical strategy can produce. First, students come to see their own positionality as processual and multi-layered, rather than static or singular. Second, students feel authorized to leverage their prior knowledge of embodied identity to create self-generated knowledge of the text. Third, students gain a mechanism for naming the damaging histories and destructive potentialities of the texts that we teach. As Eric L. de Barros reminded us, decentering the monumental quality of Shakespeare allows students to participate in the broader project of revealing toxic influences in the literary canon, and ultimately disarming them. Lastly, students come to recognize that what they have to say about the texture of human experience is as important as the Shakespearean text. The comparatively safe, deliberately constructed space of the caucus privileges students' own knowledge generation, made possible by the unique interaction of their embodied identities with the text at hand.
In traditional affinity-based caucuses, students meet regularly with the same group and are supported by a facilitator who shares the aspect of their identity that brought them together. Our caucusing model, by contrast, creates multiple temporary rooms in order to accommodate students' multifaceted identities. Our role in this process is primarily structural. We are designers, creating rooms within rooms that enable and authorize students to discover affinities with each other and the text. This role does not require us to share our students' identity positions and acknowledges the fact that we will never be able to provide an affinity match for every student in our classes. Instead, our caucusing model hinges on alliance. Both affinity and alliance work through leveraging empathy, but each activates a unique mode of feeling with. Alliance helps us establish comparatively safe caucus spaces while ultimately preparing students for the decidedly unsafe spaces beyond the classroom. In this sense, we see our work as part of a larger pedagogical project focused on giving students the confidence and the skills they need to engage in identifying and resisting structural violence. Writing about peer sex education, sociologists Jessica Fields and Martha Kopp define alliance-based empathy as a process of recognizing conflicts present in other people's lives, not one's own, and developing a sense of shared concern and purpose. Flexibility, resilience, and equity are exactly what teaching for social justice requires, precisely because there are so many barriers to social justice pedagogy. Some of these barriers are built into the rooms in which we teach. They originate in our institutions and require those of us in positions of professional security to support the innovative social justice pedagogies of our untenured colleagues. Other barriers are brought into the room by political groups and individuals, including some students, who are invested in maintaining the status quo. These barriers lead to various forms of silencing, both well-intentioned and ideologically motivated. In the face of such silences, our pedagogy focuses on creating rooms that allow more students to speak authentically.
We want to share an example that gives a sense of how plurality and alliance work in our caucusing model. This example comes from my fall 2019 class at the University of New Mexico on race and identity in Shakespeare's early plays. Students' first caucusing activity aimed to connect their local and experiential knowledge of race and lineage to Shakespeare's depiction of ancient family grudges, Romeo and Juliet. Based on the anonymous survey that students completed in the first week of class, I created 4 caucuses: Anglo, Hispanic, Native American, and multiracial. Significantly, as a Jewish woman, I do not fit easily into any of these caucuses. All the more crucial, then, to create rooms that support my alliance with students. To this end, I set up students' caucus-based discussions of Shakespearean race in Romeo and Juliet through another text, a literal monument to a mythical narrative of race relations in New Mexico. The Three Peoples murals, painted between 1938 and 1940 by Kenneth Adams, have been exhibited in the University of New Mexico's main library for 80 years, a privileged location that lends credibility to their depiction of the tricultural myth of cohabitation among the state's Anglo, Hispano, and Native American populations. Many students, faculty, and staff have protested the murals because they perpetuate, as Samuel Cisneros has written, a romantic, biased, stereotypical, and exclusive perspective of New Mexico. Because most of my undergraduates are state residents, they are familiar with this mythical narrative, but they also know alternative versions from familial stories and communal traditions. As a result, students in my class were confident reading the murals in ways that they were not with Shakespeare's play. The place where Romeo and Juliet and three peoples came together was also the place where I could come together with students. This alliance emerged from my taking seriously questions about where the students come from, literally and figuratively. In responding to students' caucus discussions, I often invited them to share their knowledge in other areas. Other times, I demonstrated that I had done my homework. In a post to the multiracial caucus, for example, one student shared her experiential knowledge of local Native American ceremonial practices. In my feedback, I asked if the student's exact reference was the initiation of Muscaero Apache women into tribal spiritual life. The student said, yes, I got it. This moment drove home how much I still need to learn about New Mexico and the importance of mindfully locating myself in the larger region. My ability to support this and other students in bringing their full selves into my classroom relies on my knowing as much as possible about the broader geography of students' lives. While I cannot identify with the lived experiences of most of my students, I can and must mobilize my recognition of their circumstances to foster a sense of shared concern and purpose, and to mobilize that commonality to build alliance.
Caucusing is just one of many tools we can use to become more conscious of the ways we engage and recognize our students for who they are, where they are, and how we inhabit spaces together. We do not view caucusing as a cure-all for the various forms of institutionalized oppression that follow us into our classrooms. We do believe that pedagogical experiments like this one, which explicitly tackle what Bell Hooks calls the reality of difference, provide an essential counterbalance to the colorblind ideologies many of us grew up with. By acknowledging that reality, we give our students room to practice telling the truth about their experiences. If they can speak that truth, they can use it to break open the seemingly hard shell of the Shakespearean text. Equally important, they can create a version of their identities that is more resilient, less vulnerable to distortion and manipulation. And perhaps in time, they can begin to take the kinds of risks that build new social worlds, rejecting the violent fantasy of a past that never was. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Marissa, for inviting me to be part of this panel, and to Katherine, Rowe, and the SAA for giving us a platform for this important conversation on Shakespeare, pedagogy, and social justice. The University of Dayton is a Marianist Catholic institution that recruits students from all over the US, but especially the Midwest, with almost half of our students coming from within the state of Ohio itself. This year, 80% of the student population is white. 7% of our students identify as Latinx, 4% Black, 1% Asian, less than 1% American Indian or Alaskan Native, less than 1% Native Hawaiian or Pacific Islander, and less than 1% in resident international students. Of the 43 full-time faculty in the Department of English, I am one of 6 non-white faculty. During my first year teaching at UD, I taught the General Shakespeare Seminar in both fall and spring that is designed for upper-level juniors and seniors. The course is open to any undergraduate student who has completed their basic writing prerequisites. And it was especially in my first year teaching that class, and oddly, only that class, that I noticed a particular affect and earnestness that seemed to hinder student curiosity and willingness to be more exploratory, to be more open to discussions of power dynamics and oppression, and to be vulnerable within the learning community. I do think that my observations must be understood regarding the fact that I was a new faculty member at the institution, whose race, age, and gender neither coincided with the kind of teacher of Shakespeare students had in the past, in the department in general, nor was I likely the kind of instructor they envisioned for a Shakespeare course. In what follows, I discuss my experiences with students who convey the entwinement of Shakespeare with their faith systems and the perceptions of Shakespeare as a universalizing moral figure. As university undergraduate curriculums are being revised across the United States in response to the dire need to remain competitive for the sake of financial sustainability and survival, we are challenged to consider what we are doing with the knowledge we create and why teaching Shakespeare for social justice has always been important and is a necessary collective effort. In the spring term, that first year of teaching at UD, I had a meet and greet conversation with a student from my Shakespeare seminar at the start of the second week of classes. The student informed me that she may have to leave the course since she worried that the contents of the discussions of the class would be in conflict with her spiritual development. She is a woman of faith, she declared. The student was very earnest about two things. One, she repeatedly emphasized that she was learning, a lot in fact, and that she liked me and liked the course. However, she was struggling with how she believed that our discussions on the rape of Lucrece were not things that she should be talking about as a young Catholic woman. Our classes are comprised of students with varying levels of preparedness and comfort to engage with early modern syntax and analysis, and also sensitive and painful topics like sexual violence. And I am forthright with my students about the difficult and demanding issues we confront in my classes that could be potentially triggering for them. And I understand that some students will decide that my courses are ultimately not for them, or perhaps not for them at this time. I respect their decisions, and with this student, I did my best to embolden her to stay in the course, but also to do what she felt was right. What stays with me from that conversation was her affect, the intensity of her earnestness and her commitment to a particular vision of Shakespeare that she had prior to coming to the course and that she wanted the seminar to confirm. She shared that I should have the class read works that are more in line with Shakespeare, his happier and less violent plays like The Tempest. Of course, there is violence in The Tempest and scenes of domestic abuse. I too find great value in discussing The Tempest with students, in part because it offers us the chance to interrogate dynamics of power and to question the narratives of violence that are effaced or justified. The play has us consider who deserves forgiveness and happiness, whose privilege is enabled through the oppression and enslavement of others. For the student, The Tempest is a happy play, which was far more fitting for a Catholic woman to study, analyze, and discuss. In the week of our meet and greet, we have been analyzing how chastity in Lucrece is linked to Lucrece's status as property, as a movable good that can be expropriated and taken from her owner, how chastity and the violence she sustained were entwined. Overwhelmingly, and especially after that first year teaching at the university, the students who attend my classes find our social justice approach to Shakespeare in concert with the Marianist values of the institution. However, I have had a few other students, not many, who have politely voiced at some point in the semester their concern that our discussions were not in keeping with Christian values. I had not experienced this until teaching at UD. I expect our classroom conversations to bring forth discomfort for students and for me at some point in the semester. And I informed the class that our learning will be exciting and meaningful, and they will tackle divisive topics and will likely elicit feelings of discomfort. And that's a good thing. What has remained with me from that conversation is not the students' discomfort with wrestling with the ways that ideals of chastity have enabled objectification and sexual violence. That is understandably painful to think about, especially if a student has been consistently told to extol the virtues of chastity and to see it as a protection against rape. The onus is placed on the victim and not on the assailant. The misogynist attack on survivors, it was their fault for not being chaste enough. What sticks with me from that specific conversation with a student, my first year teaching, is the yoking of discussions that are unchristian-like with being un-Shakespearean. Some of our students are likely drawn to Shakespeare because they anticipate that his works will confirm their particular and niche idea of proper Christian morals, faith beliefs that are aligned with maintaining and defending racist, heterosexist, ableist, patriarchal norms. I think about the students' alignment of Shakespeare with a particular kind of Americanized right-wing version of Christian faith, in which the pursuit of justice is all well and good until you begin critiquing white patriarchal heterosexist values. Students who are not pursuing education and who elect to take this course often do so because of having previously enjoyed classes on Shakespeare from high school. And it is also clear to me that some students love Shakespeare because they have been taught to see him as moral. In Nashville, I joined a collective conversation in 2014 that was part of Shakespeare on the Road. The forum gathered practitioners of Shakespeare, actors, and teachers from all levels of education. One group of questions asked was, why do you teach Shakespeare? Why do you perform his works? Why is he of such significance to Americans? And one of the responses included, Shakespeare makes people moral, which received vigorous nods and words of affirmation. Shakespeare makes us moral. This view of Shakespeare has benefited from the incorporation of Shakespeare as a crucial part of the American curriculum in the late 19th and early 20th century that presented Shakespeare as this moralizing force whose works like Julius Caesar and The Merchant of Venice could warn youths about the sins of sedition and propagate the glories of Christian compassion and mercy. These were also the two most commonly taught plays in American high schools and American colonial schools in the early 20th century. Now, I do wholeheartedly believe that Shakespeare's works can be used for social justice, which is not the same as ceding our agency to Shakespeare, which in effect disempowers us and, more importantly, prevents us from self-reflection on our own politics of knowledge creation. As teachers, students, audiences, performers, and directors, it is what we do with Shakespeare and not what he does to or for us that I wish to impress on my students and empower them to see themselves as actively shaping what Shakespeare means to us now and what he will mean for our future. Even before COVID-19, which has placed many colleges and universities in financial duress, I am sure that many of us have heard about concerns regarding financial sustainability of our institutions in the decades to come. As explained in Nathan Grau's Demographics and the Demand of Higher Education, the 2007 economic recession in the United States caused a birth dearth from which the nation has not recovered, nor is likely to do so. This poses a problem for universities since the financial infrastructures we have in place are generally based on a model of assumed increase in student populations. Some universities are struggling to remain competitive, to attract prospective students, and to survive, quite frankly. And this survival mode will inevitably have ramifications that will be felt by all institutions and our scholarly communities that will change the face of higher education in general. Undergraduate curriculums across the nation are being modified to attend to these financial stresses. And with AP credit and college credit classes that students can take while in high school, the fast track to graduation might, for some institutions, mean lessening the number of required courses for students to take in the humanities. And this is attractive for potential prospective students. A few of my closest friends and fellow early modernists are right now navigating the precarity and vulnerability that result from such changes in the curriculum that are responses to financial duress. Some are not sure if they will still have a department next year, and if so, what will be left of that department. And for those of us who have home departments for the foreseeable future, it might very well be the case that our students will not take a single literary and cultural studies class in pursuit of their degrees. At UD, I have had many seniors from a host of disciplines inform me that they have only taken one course from the English department back when they were freshmen fulfilling their writing requirement, and then the Shakespeare class they were taking with me in their final semester of college. When asked, why this course then? One responded, if I'm going to be taking any English course, it might as well be Shakespeare. Others see Shakespeare as a challenge, a necessary literary figure for all serious undergraduates to have engaged with at some point in their college careers. Some remember their high school teacher and how much they loved Macbeth and Hamlet. Regardless of the variety of reasons they have for taking my courses, every semester I have had students express their surprise and gratefulness at having been able to engage candidly with the divisive and difficult topics of today through our discussions of Shakespeare's works. It is quite common for my Shakespeare class specifically to attract a more diverse student body with very different values, political leanings, and expectations for what they will learn in a Shakespeare class. I am committed to teaching Shakespeare with a focus on social justice. Why is this so important? I have had juniors and seniors state that they have never taken courses that force them to reckon with the long and interwoven histories of systemic oppression, violence, and white supremacy. And it is precisely because my Shakespeare classes in particular offer them this, and this might be specific to UD, and that these Shakespeare classes tend to attract students with very different values and experiential perspectives, levels of privilege, and lived vulnerabilities that I find it so crucial and imperative to use Shakespeare to strive toward a more just, compassionate, reflective, and actively anti-racist future by getting them to talk with one another and listen to each other. And above all, this commitment to social justice undergirds why I teach, and it is what I owe to our communities. Since this panel is about walking the talk, I wanted to provide you all with a few actionable strategies that I incorporate in the classes I teach. The first one are meet and greets. These have always been important to me, and this year especially, in which so many of our students are burned out, struggling with illness and deaths in their families, economic stresses, mental wellness, and the daily reminders that we are living in a country that caters to white supremacists. I meet with my students at the start of the semester for introductory conversations, which often last just 15 minutes. In these conversations, students often share background information, assumptions they have about the early modern period, about Shakespeare and the class, and their feelings about the difficult and potentially triggering material that we will be encountering as a collective. I use those conversations to frame future discussions and lectures and to inform my selection of additional sources for the course. The next would be anonymous notes and surveys. As teachers, I believe it is important to make our classes accessible and to do what we can to optimize the learning of all students, and not just the ones who have historically been deemed fit enough for an education. This is demanding of us as educators, both emotionally and physically. When students enter our classrooms, we cannot assume that every student will see us as someone they can trust. And a basic level of goodwill and trust is necessary for the difficult work of our classrooms. As Karen Buenavista-Hanna has stated, students who might not feel that the classroom is a space accessible to them have likely experienced the repercussions of white heteropatriarchal ableist norms that often pervade our spaces of learning. One way that I have endeavored to build a rapport based on trust with my students is to encourage their communication with me in low stakes and anonymous ways. My purpose is to help them see how my pedagogy is grounded in my investment to be responsive to them and flexible in my teaching strategies, which is only possible through communication. Periodically throughout the semester, I have my students provide me with anonymous messages, either in the form of note cards or electronically. At the end of the session, I give students about 5 minutes to do one of two things. They could either write about what they learned from the discussion in any format, lists, short paragraphs, or they could use that note to express something that they think is important for me to be aware of based on their experience in that class that day. Or if a professor in a different course is incorporating useful teaching tools or exercises that they think could be useful in our Shakespearean classroom, I invite them to share that with me as well. I keep this pretty open-ended, and I also use those cards to reflect on what my students are getting from our class discussions. Are their notes to me reflective of the objectives of the class? Are their notes reflective of a discussion that is working toward dismantling white, heterosexist, ableist ideologies that they may have identified with Shakespeare in one way or another? I hope that this unsettling helps students to recognize the ways that our differing methodologies and investments shape the knowledge we create and what we do with that knowledge. As Valerie Traub asked us to consider deeply, quote, how do we know what we think we know? I want my classes to question the historic truth students think they know, to unsettle an exclusionary and oppressive version of Shakespeare that may have been the object of their earnest devotion. Next, video lectures. Over the last year, I have learned that video lectures are very time-consuming to create. However, they have proven extremely beneficial for preparing students for our group class discussions. Not only do these videos contain more detailed information about the text that students will be reading, but they also help to prepare them mentally and emotionally to engage with sensitive and difficult materials. Specifically, these captioned video lectures prime them for our discussion. Students can choose where to watch the lectures and with whom. They can pause the videos at any point and resume watching later. They can mute the lecture if necessary when engaging with triggering materials. And above all, these video lectures can be used to prepare students for the kinds of discussions that you hope to have with the class. Unsettle to empower. One way to help destabilize the idea that Shakespeare belongs to white people, or that there is one right or ideal way to do Shakespeare, is to show students scenes or stills from contemporary and global performances of Shakespeare. MIT's Global Shakespeare's Video and Performance Archive is an excellent resource, and it empowers students to see that Shakespeare today is adaptation, appropriation, play, and how people of different cultures have used Shakespeare to address local issues and forms of injustices. Lastly, support networks, networks of learning. Know people at your institution doing work that intersects with yours. Find your group of teacher friends and mentors located beyond your institution with whom you can talk and strategize. We know that teaching is an ever-evolving process, and we are constantly learning, making mistakes, and growing. There's real vulnerability there, which is something that we'll likely talk about during the Q&A. And it is important to have people to help guide you and learn with and from. Shakespeare's canonization allows us to confront how our institutions of learning have been used to oppress the most disenfranchised members of our communities, to justify violence, and to construct and maintain white supremacy. Rather than give my students the early modern world they anticipate that is white, heterosexist, and ableist, I do what I can to be responsive, to reflect on my students' learning, and to structure my classes with early modern texts and secondary sources that challenge the particular vision they might have of Shakespeare, of England, and of the early moderns, and of the histories that continue to be used to validate the targeted acts of violence in our present. I end by remembering Ruben Espinosa's evocative call to action. It is your mountainish inhumanity that haunts me. And standing here amid that barbaric wall and the open wound of this borderland community, I urge you not just to stand with refugees, immigrants, and those dark of skin, but to stand against white supremacy by committing to anti-racist efforts anytime you sit to read, sit to write, or stand before your students who are seeking to make sense of the world around them. So much of what I have shared with you today has been in recognition of and in response to the Shakespeare we have inherited, the Shakespeare that many of our students imagine. But Shakespeare is not a monolith. It is easy to think that we are alone in the work we do in our classrooms. We must remember that there are Shakespeare scholars and teachers in high schools and in higher education, artists and theater companies, domestic and global, who have committed themselves to standing in solidarity against white supremacy. Our individual decisions, whether to stand in solidarity or to ignore that call, are impacting Shakespeare for future generations. And I am heartened with the knowledge that so many of us in our research and in our teaching are committed to social justice. We are revitalizing Shakespeare's works and making him accessible, inspiring, and urgent to people who might not have thought that Shakespeare could mean anything to them. The future does not belong to white supremacists. We are breathing meaning into Shakespeare, and we are making a place for him in our vision of a more just world.
Hello, everyone, and thanks for coming. I begin with my gratitude for my students and my colleagues here on the panel. I'm honored to work with and learn from them all. Thank you as well to the SAA for supporting this work and conversation. So today I'm concerned with how I, as a white instructor within classrooms dedicated to the teaching of Shakespeare's work and its reproduction in predominantly white communities, commit to the beyond in my title. That beyond is motivated, per Harney and Moten, by commitment to reckoning with the relation between such communities and the undercommons, the lived experience of BIPOC people, queers, trans, disabled, and poor people, and the ways in which fictions of whiteness shape of politics of violent normativity. The question this commitment raises for me is this: how can I teach Shakespeare as a means of illuminating and resisting the dispossession, erasure, and consequent suffering that blindness to the work of whiteness in Shakespeare entails, and upon which the educational system and my community continue to rely? I acknowledge that it is easier to ask questions than to realize their answers in practice, though I will suggest some of mine. Yet orientations are important, and this one consistently challenges me to rethink how I make of my classroom a third space, one in which students and I collectivize to reckon with the nature and work of whiteness in Shakespeare. As Harney and Moten suggest, the beyond of such teaching is a matter of relation, not destination, though ends are crucial. So bear with me as I think aloud about how I teach Shakespeare's work in ways that invite my students to, quote, be unlawfully overcome by others, to be, quote, unfit for subjection, and thus jubilant killjoys. Focusing on the representations of and appropriations of whiteness in Shakespeare and the forms of resistance it might suggest is to make explicit the legacies that enter our spaces with Shakespeare and that structure my university and community. Grounded then in the local and historical, we begin with where we are, living in a predominantly white community and working in a predominantly white university in the Pacific Northwest. At the end of our first class, I invite my students to anonymously tell me what they hope for and fear about our work together. Consistently, fears of inadequacy to Shakespeare's work dominate, counterbalanced by timid hopes for acquiring an anointing mastery. I share these concerns with the students at the start of the second class as evidence of a colonizing Shakespeare used to measure one's social power, one's belonging, and ask that they try to recognize and resist that narrative. Yet they are not alone. Even among teachers of Shakespeare whose commitment to their students I respect at both the college and secondary level, I still frequently hear the phrase cultural capital used as justification for teaching Shakespeare. What possible use is a commodified Shakespeare to any of us, I wonder? Most of all, my students, some of whose histories and communities have been destroyed by slavery and its aftermath, violently subjugated or erased via colonialism, or abandoned in favor of assimilation to heteropatriarchy and whiteness. In any classroom, but particularly those like mine, dominated by white students whose lived relation to BIPOC folks is structured overwhelmingly by the unacknowledged, racialized histories of their communities. The problem of whiteness as both a fiction of power and a lived experience shapes our sense of identity and community. I tell them that I don't believe now, or ever have, that knowledge of Shakespeare's work alone, or its presumed currency among certain classes, is what they need to survive and thrive. Yet here I am, along with you, at a conference dedicated to Shakespeare, having devoted much of my working life to teaching Shakespeare as a means of creating more, not less, social justice. So how can the analysis of whiteness in Shakespeare, especially by white faculty and students, clarify that work? As Katherine Romero-Santos asks of the Folgers National Tour of the First Folio, the book that gave us Shakespeare, the first question we need to ask is, who is us? And how might such a commodified object invite us to rethink our relation to Shakespeare? Discussing my students' fears and hopes with them makes clear not only that studying Shakespeare involves killjoy practices, such as situating our reading in difficult histories, manifest in his work and our lives, but most pressingly, the production and costs of whiteness within them both. In this way, the work of demythologizing Shakespeare entails the question of how specifically we make ourselves unfit for subjection to such myths and the erasures they entail. Talking about what a commitment to center our work in the troubled and troubling intersection of racial myths in which Shakespeare is implicated, we attend to historical memory and its manifestations in our lives and communities in the Pacific Northwest. This collaborative groundwork makes our shared analysis of our distinct responses to the reading explicit and thus potentially transformative. The differences of our lives as subjects of our family's relation to the American West, their origin there or journeys from elsewhere, our relation to other parts of the country and world, and the histories of racialization there, seeds the ground for our analysis of a Shakespeare similarly shaped by practices of white Christian supremacy in Europe and elsewhere, by the global movement of people, and the representations of categories of difference proliferated by the technology of print. Through this work, the power of student stories and those of Shakespeare combine to illuminate the possibility of resisting a commodified Shakespeare. Instead, a practice of careful attention to the work itself and engagement with a wide range of critical and personal responses to it reveals a Shakespeare as complex, troubled, and troubling as the world in which it took shape and those in which it has since been taken up, most pressingly our own. For some time, I've been doing this work by focusing primarily on the tragedies and situating these dramas of loss, suffering, and death within the painful histories of dispossession, appropriation, and erasure that Shakespeare renders. This is not a liberationist pedagogy, but rather a deeply political and practical one in which attention to history, theory, language, form, and our relationship to each other and our own communities center and complicate our work. By focusing on tragedy, I invite my students to consider the human self, its inherent vulnerability and capacity for connection, and the consequent strength and weakness of the communities and worlds that Shakespeare and we reciprocally reinforce again and again. I'll back up a little bit. By focusing on tragedy, I invite my students to consider the human self, its inherent vulnerability and capacity for connection, and the consequent strength and weakness of the communities and worlds that Shakespeare and we reciprocally reinforce or resist. Again and again, we return to the Aristotelian hierarchical binaries that structure the worlds of Shakespeare's plays and their consequences for action and being within them. Questions of ethical relation and the ways in which we see or are blind to others given the structures we inherit, learn to believe in, and attend to or ignore organically arise. We nurture these questions via readings of the work of Imtiaz Habib, Kim Hall, and others that document historical accounts of early modern difference embodied in the form of color and racial category, and their associations with religious belief and practice, gender, sexuality, and socioeconomic power. These texts are joined by the critical and theoretical work of writers who have long called our attention to the nature of racialized and gendered privilege and its costs in our communities. James Baldwin, Audre Lorde, Patricia Williams, and Cheryl Harris, to name just a few. In this way, our attention to whiteness in plays like King Lear, Coriolanus, Othello, or Romeo and Juliet invites conversation about the fact that racialization is, to quote Anne Stoller, not subsequent to social order, but constitutive of it. Because white characters of many kinds in these tragedies reinforce such systems, even in the absence of racialized others, the nature of racialization's effects becomes clearer, both in our own communities and in Shakespeare's work. Expanding my students' attention to whiteness in Shakespeare is a means of entering the beyond of teaching that Harney and Moten describe. Because together we acknowledge the fiction of race as essence and its material power as a form of social belief. This work is a killjoy practice, especially for white students. Often initially very painful, the pleasures of the killjoy take some time to emerge. One of the earliest to appear is the opening of a space in which, by studying the nature and power of whiteness in Shakespeare's text and its legacy, we begin to glimpse the pleasure of our own vulnerability, or the pleasure of becoming unlawfully overcome by others. How does this happen? There is the initial work of building the collective in the early days of the class, but it happens in great part by persistently situating our work in the present and the beyond of our community. For example, attending to past and present, we acknowledge that we all live and work on the ancestral land of the sovereign nations of Lummi and Nooksack people, of whose community and history most white people in our community, including students, know very little. By attending to our racial history, we reckon with the fact that we live and work in a town that has a history of exploiting the labor of Black, Sikh, Chinese, and Latinx people, and then violently dispossessing and excluding them when local whites view the strength of their communities as threats. That we live and work in a town that had a sundown law as recently as the 70s and a cross burning in an adjacent farm community in the early 90s. BIPOC students and their white co-conspirators testify to the experience of white supremacy by people of color in our community while going about their daily lives. In the course of attending to and acknowledging this history, Shakespeare's representation of whiteness as an implicit, explicit, and fundamental form of power exists not apart from our lives, but within them. The nature of whiteness, its function, its normativity, and the violence done explicitly and implicitly in its name in Shakespeare's work joins past and present, self and other, and thus makes of his text not a commodity, but an invitation to reckon with how his tragic art directs our attention to the structures of power, its illusions of security, and its costs for his characters and communities, including our own. In what time remains, I'll briefly describe other practices I use in pursuing this pedagogy, speak a little bit about the challenges these methods continue to present me, and leave you with some questions. I've split my practices into curricular and communal. I'll begin with curricular. Briefly, we commit to the dialectical engagement of past and present. In our reading and interpretation of Shakespeare, we commit to reckoning with Shakespeare's formal conventions and the epistemological, ontological, and hence ethical assumptions such conventions entail. Commit to our appropriation of Shakespeare and analysis of Shakespeare's appropriations as means of resistance to the commodified, institutionalized Shakespeare and its racist legacies. And finally, less is more. Going deep rather than wide is a form of resistance to, I believe, the structures of white supremacy. Our communal practices, to which we commit on day one and challenge each other to sustain, guide our dialogue. These explicitly resist the institutional presumption that our classroom is a space for the production of professionals, with all the behavioral conformity to the reproduction of normative forms of power that term often entails. Building on the work of Caprice Hollins and Ilse Govan, I emphasize that these are practices that we all struggle to sustain and thus will fail at in the course of our work. These practices have helped us, but I continually see the ways in which, through our failures to observe them, they illuminate the difficulty of this work. Because talking about the nature of whiteness in Shakespeare has its ghostly effects. Whiteness does that. It haunts us by way of its insistence on primacy, its assumptions of power, its demand for complicity, its silencing and violent effects in exchange for inclusion and illusions of security. In a city, university, department, and classroom that are predominantly white, as mine are, the haunting is pervasive and once acknowledged palpable to all, despite any initial relief in naming racialized constructs and their very real effects. The discussion of the meaning of whiteness in my classroom, via analysis of its variations and effects in Shakespeare and many of our other texts and our own lives, is hard, and failure is inevitable. Some white students, tired of the burdens of the work, fall back into formulaic readings in order to recoup a sense of their own seemingly lost interpretive power and the pleasures they experience in exercising it. Others see this newly complicated Shakespeare as affirming their experience of the world, its injustices, its forms of caste identification, and the violence of exclusion, but lose their ability to see its moments of compassion or resistance. Some students worry about their capacity to teach the functions of whiteness in Shakespeare's texts as future teachers. What use is Shakespeare when they could be teaching texts that more directly challenge white supremacy? How can they do this work as high school teachers without being branded political, risking their new, hard-won livelihood? These are not trivial experiences or questions. Let me be clear. I am not against the pleasures of Shakespeare, but I believe such pleasures are most profound when rooted in a complex and historically grounded understanding of his work in relation to the lives and legacies that shape our own existence, and the power of whiteness is one that shapes us all. Though classroom commitments to the practices I've mentioned help a great deal in confronting myths and unproductive conflicts, I struggle with the power of Shakespeare over my students and my own role in making space for their struggles. For example, in the thick of student discussion, I continue to learn when to remind students of our commitments and the ways in which privilege shows up as risk aversion or dominance. I struggle to trust the relational limits of my role or the learning they experience and offer each other in a predominantly white classroom. I struggle with how to share my own story of racialization in order to model the distinct ways in which systemic violence can be masked by liberalism and the self-serving advocacy of others. I struggle when to contribute to student debates or how I might illuminate or derail a crucial moment in which they are grappling painfully with the nexus in Shakespeare between language, action, and the effects of specific representations on bodies and lives, including their own. The students' collaborative and sometimes combative reckoning with the productive power of whiteness in Shakespeare's work and the painful history of their own instruction in its defining significance and violent enforcement makes my classes a rich and often fraught experience. Sometimes I trust that relation. Sometimes I worry about it. I want to celebrate the power of my students to reckon with Shakespeare's language, his capacity to give vivid life to embodied suffering, and acts of compassion that resist the hierarchies of power he represents. Doing so means trusting in their unsettled, but larger and more intimate understanding of a Shakespeare now tied to their past, present, and potential futures. Focusing on the production of whiteness in Shakespeare and our worlds is unsettling, but flipping the problem of racialization back to whiteness opens up Black, queer, and non-Western responses to Shakespeare, girding students against the ever-resurgent idea of Shakespeare's work as uniform in meaning and value, as residing in the histories, lives, and practices of people whose claimed whiteness and its cost remain largely unacknowledged by white people. 26 years ago, Kim Hall concluded Things of Darkness with the challenge, quote, to acknowledge the ongoing legacy of this thing of darkness and use that knowledge to create new ways of thinking about difference. Many scholars of color, and some white ones, have taken up this work. Yet so much work remains, especially for white teachers in predominantly white classrooms and institutions like mine. In the spirit of my commitment to the beyond of learning and the pleasures of being a killjoy, I'll end with some questions that I hope nurture the dialogue about addressing whiteness in predominantly white Shakespeare classrooms, especially by white faculty. And here they are. I'll leave them there for you to read for a moment, and I thank you very much.
First, I'd like to thank Marissa Greenberg for bringing us together on this panel, and specifically for the opportunity to share my thoughts on the challenges of teaching Shakespeare for social justice, and more specifically in urban America. In Jason Zeldas's Romeo is Bleeding, a 2015 documentary film about an urban adaptation of Romeo and Juliet entitled Tay's Harmony, the two questions of my primary title are the governing, largely unspoken ones driving the narrative. Trapped within and traumatized by the drug and gang-related gun violence plaguing Richmond, California, and by extension, urban Black and Brown America, Dante Clark, a co-founder of and reluctant teacher mentor for an after-school creative arts program named Raw Talent, comes to see in Romeo and Juliet the possibilities of a recreative, expressive way out. As both the play adaptation and film capture, Clark and his student collaborators urgently engage in a disciplined and hopeful process of rewriting Romeo and Juliet into a life-saving vehicle for the verbal and performative dexterity of spoken word poetry, a dexterity the film highlights with an impressive combination of, excuse me, soulful music, dramatic sound effects, bold lighting, and extreme close-ups. In short, the film's representation of this spoken word adaptation of Shakespeare, particularly its representation of Clark's performances, is nothing short of dazzling. However, that dexterity should come as no surprise, for performative lyricism in Black America is as old as the various manifestations of white oppression it was and continues to be forged to combat. In fact, as if oblivious to that long history, the film urgently attempts to create for itself the impression that spoken word poetry represents something sufficiently new and potentially transformative to merit filming, specifically enhancing the sense of a Miranda-like brave new world of urban pedagogical possibilities. The Shakespearean vehicle is, of course, central to that impression. However, there is also nothing new about a film devoted to the liberal pedagogical fantasy that Shakespeare possesses the power to save urban Black lives. Of course, time will not allow me to chart that history. Therefore, I will focus for the most part on Clark's adaptation in Zeldas's film as representative examples of the insidious way in which all of these types of films and programs advance one or another version of Shakespeare as poetry in the interest of, as I will explain, a neoliberal pedagogy of figurative denial. To provide just a bit more context, these programs, as Ayanna Thompson explains, are so committed to Shakespeare's universality, authority, authenticity, and textual stability that any discussion of race becomes ironically irrelevant to the racialized people they are supposedly intended to reform. And while for Thompson, one promising exception is the LA-based Willpower to Youth program profiled in Lawrence Bridges' Why Shakespeare, specifically for its focus on appropriation, adaptation, and revision, I am not entirely persuaded that that critical engagement necessarily makes a difference. The reason is that in both types of programs, Shakespeare represents something more than Shakespeare. That is more fundamental and potentially more insidious than just privileging the authority of Shakespeare. Shakespeare also, or alternatively, represents highly aestheticized poetic language as a superior mode of expression. And while Willpower to Youth's focus on appropriation, adaptation, and revision may be invested with the potential to transform urban lives, its acceptance of this definition arguably limits, if not works against, that potential. For instance, when Ben Donnenberg, Willpower to Youth's artistic director, explains iambic pentameter as Shakespeare asking your heart to sync up with his characters, or when Chris Anthony, the program's associate director, describes Shakespeare as the gift of Shakespeare, we are left to wonder about the ethical implications of applying this understanding of poetry, of syncing hearts and a gift to the lives of people oppressed by the most unpoetic of circumstances. Theodore Adorno's "To write poetry after Auschwitz is barbaric" is perhaps the most famous expression of this ethical skepticism. However, it is but one of the many instances that forced me over the course of my education to stop, usually when it was especially costly to do so, and think seriously about the role that I was being trained to play in a beautifully barbaric culture that has almost always represented me as the ugliest kind of barbarian. There was Tadeusz Borowski's realization, as expressed in his collection of concentration camp stories, that oppression and exploitation is the price of civilization, and that the fate of the oppressed and exploited who are forced to live filthy lives and die real deaths is that they will be forgotten, drowned out by the voices of the poets, the jurists, the philosophers, the priests, who will produce their own beauty, virtue, truth, and religion. There was Joseph Conrad's Heart of Darkness and its representation of the power of courtesy and eloquence, the gift of voice, expression, poetry, to obscure and thereby perpetuate the ugly realities of European imperialism, which mostly means the violent taking of the earth away from those who have a different complexion and flatter noses. There was Chinua Achebe's Things Fall Apart and its identification of the insidious colonizing poetry of Christianity. There was Ray Durham's I Know I'm Not Sufficiently Obscure and its rejection of the capacity of poetic language to represent the violent oppression of Black people with a startling concluding address to white poets. You deal with finer feelings, very subtle, an autumn leaf hanging from a tree. I see a body. Similarly, there was Nikki Giovanni's For Sandra and its rejection of conventional poetry because for oppressed Black people, these are not poetic times at all. Specifically in terms of Shakespeare, there was Titus Andronicus and its gruesome illustration of the failure of poetic language, when in particular Marcus awkwardly attempts to aestheticize the blood flowing from the mouth of a raped and mutilated Lavinia as a crimson river of blood, like to a bubbling fountain stirred with wind, doth rise and fall between thy rosed lips, coming and going with thy honey breath. While not about poetic language per se, there was also Stephen Greenblatt's Marvelous Possessions and the way the devastation of Amerindian peoples and culture compels him to ask, should we not say then that words do not matter, because before concluding that we are thus forced to abandon the dream of linguistic omnipotence. And finally, specifically in terms of the representational dangers of film itself, there was Robert Levinthal's uncompromising critique of Stephen Greenblatt's Schindler's List for using romantic conventions of narrative to wipe away the horrific material realities of the Holocaust. So what Clark's play and Zeldas's film failed to acknowledge is what these reflections made it impossible for me to ignore. That the relationship between poetic language and the bodies of oppressed people is anything but obviously good. In fact, it is precisely through that failure that Clark and Zeldas employ Shakespeare as poetry to romanticize and thereby avoid the ugly, interconnected workings of racist power as historically internalized within and inscribed upon suffering Black bodies. As published by Redbeard Press, the play's front matter variously celebrates the Shakespeare's poetry fantasy of urban reform. In the acknowledgements, Molly Rayner, the other co-founder of Raw Talent and Clark's mentor, thanks him for all of the hard work, love, energy, and thought he put into the script before sharing. It was amazing to walk into work every day and see Dante deeply engrossed in Romeo and Juliet. I could tell from the way he would smirk and chuckle to himself that once he began making connections between Verona and Richmond, he came to truly appreciate the genius and humor of Shakespeare. He found a way to honor the original text without being confined by it. Although Rayner concludes that that breakthrough results in an adaptation that challenges the reader to imagine a counter-narrative to Shakespeare's tragedy, the actual play, as I'm arguing, does nothing of the sort. That is, Clark's adaptation doesn't so much challenge us to imagine a counter-narrative, as much as it teases us with flashes of poetic brilliance before letting us off the hook with an evasive deus ex machina resolution. And that way, what enables Rayner to make and presumably believe such a claim is that her privileging of Shakespeare's poetry is so strong that all Clark really needed to do was demonstrate a sufficient reverence for it in both process and product. For Rayner, the immediate inspiration for this thinking is actually not Shakespeare, but Louis J. Rodriguez, the former poet laureate of Los Angeles and author of Tay Harmony's Foreword. As Rayner acknowledges, Rodriguez is the model for what we are trying to accomplish with this play, creating social change through art. And we are so grateful for the work that he is doing around violence prevention and communal healing. While I cannot speak to Rodriguez's work, I am, however, concerned with his articulation in the foreword of a personal, neoliberal, even Oprah Winfrey style understanding of creative expression. For Rodriguez, that expression has little, if anything, to do with the cultivation of a revolutionary critical consciousness. On the contrary, it is about the reformation, really the salvation of the individual from the physical and emotional consequences of life in urban America. In that way, for Rodriguez, creative expression works on and through the bourgeois individual of its own creation as a secular religion with all of its attendant neoliberal colonizing potential. There are at least two troubling ways that Clark's play realizes that potential. The objectification of the Black female body is one, and the second, as I've already indicated, is its deus ex machina resolution. In the first instance, after Tay, the Romeo character, meets Harmony, the Juliet character, he poetically gazes on her with, "But I can hear it, the eruption of her blood from volcanic times in Richmond that mold her obsidian dark shades of hardened rock exterior, bruised and brittle deep within, with a sharpened shine that's as fair, that's fair, a black stone, a jewel fashioned for kings to wear." While a sympathetic attempt to represent Harmony as a victim of Richmond's traumatizing realities, this passage ironically repeats that victimization with its poetic, symbolic objectification of her as a valuable piece of jewelry fashioned to be worn by a king like Tay presumably imagines himself to be. The obvious problem is that this, as well as the several other instances of female objectification, has little to do with Shakespeare as interpreted by more than 30 years of feminist and critical race scholarship. In other words, it lacks any critical or ethical awareness of Shakespeare's own complex representation of the violent, racialized, and imperialistic power implicated in the tradition of the Petrarchan love blazon that he inherited. Clark can't see any of this because Shakespeare as poetry ideology, or the Shakespeare as poetry ideology, won't allow him to. Indeed, as Laura Mulvey might describe, the point of that ideology, defined as it is by the pleasure and beauty of patriarchal creativity, is to deny this type of destructive, ethically oriented analysis. That's what I think ultimately explains Clark's decision to turn Shakespeare's tragedy into a romance. As the play progresses to its tragic conclusion, a nurse narrator interrupts the final scene with, "We know you are expecting us to choose death." After which she, Tay, and Harmony declare, "But tonight we choose life." This deus ex machina comes a few scenes after Clark's version of the Mercutio-Tybalt double homicide. In that scene, after Tay shoots and kills T.Y., the Tybalt character, for shooting and killing Gemini, the Mercutio character, he hides out in a nearby town. Soon after, he learns that a pregnant Harmony has been beaten and hospitalized, and that rumor has it that he's responsible. He decides to return, declaring, "Whatever happens, happens. But I gotta see my girl in my seed." Both families converge on the hospital with every intention of continuing the tragic cycle of violence. This is where the nurse narrator steps in to enable the play to end with everyone laughing and dancing. The only problem is that this choice of life depends on forgetting the earlier scene of death, and specifically that Tay is still wanted for T.Y.'s killing. Although Tay's "whatever happens, happens" indicates a willingness to accept the responsibility, nothing ultimately happens. And more disturbingly, there is no sense that there will ever be a moral or judicial reckoning for the tragic loss of Black life. Indeed, much like Ray Durham's imitation of the white poet's representation of a lynched Black body as an autumn leaf hanging from a tree, the Black bodies left by T.Y. and Gemini evaporate within the romanticizing spoken word flourish that ends the play. So, if there's any hope of answering my titular question, who shot Romeo and how can we stop the bleeding, it will first require our courage as teacher scholars to be rude, unpleasant, and yes, unpoetic enough to reject Shakespeare as poetry and to call out all those committed to perpetuating it. In that regard, it's time for us to talk about white people. Much like so much of today's social justice rhetoric, with so many white people all of a sudden embarrassedly asserting that Black lives matter, another function of Shakespeare's poetry is to hide the role of white people vis-a-vis Black oppression through what Teju Cole usefully describes as the white savior industrial complex. That complex, as Cole explains, is not about justice. It is about confirming white power through sentimental stories that always cast a good and benevolent white person as the messianic answer to Black and brown suffering. Indeed, as Matthew Huey also explains, these narratives help repair, especially in unsettled and racially charged times like today, what is truly the most dangerous myth of race, a tale of normal and natural white paternalism. In that regard, the dazzling lyricism of Clark's play works to render the good white people in control of it all. A white publisher, a white teacher, a white filmmaker, and a Latino poet with white friends. Normal and natural to the point of invisible. Therefore, it is not just that the play's neoliberal pedagogy of figurative denial is not about justice for Blacks or for Black people. It is also, as disturbingly, for and about the power-confirming sentimental needs of white people and the white savior complex that continues to produce them. In terms of the film, briefly, as I began, this film is beautifully filmed and centers its attention on the performative brilliance of Clark's poetry. However, the story he co-narrates with Raynor is a tired, unpoetic one of a drug-dealing juvenile delinquent saved by a young white woman somehow deemed qualified to teach him 11th grade English. For instance, as he tells that story, he unapologetically expresses his disdain for the charter school prep academy that brought them together. Indeed, after confessing, "I don't give a fuck about college," he also suggests, despite admitting regret for his complicity in the killing of Black people, that his primary interest in the creative writing program Raynor asked him to help her start is to use it as an alternative way of making money. In this regard, as a school-hating, money-loving young Black man with the gift of gab, Clark is the perfect frontman for the kind of neoliberal agenda focused on beautifully representing Black suffering as an alternative to a distraction from the desperate need for intelligent solutions. And although Zeldes's camera loves Clark, it also always makes sure to frame and thereby contain his image, his words, and his story with Raynor, the loving white teacher who saved him from the streets. Indeed, she's always somewhere on the margin of a shot, silently reminding us that Clark and the program belong to her. And whenever she emerges, it is not to help Clark confront and work through something like the limiting effects of his anti-intellectual materialism. It is merely to express personal, sentimental concern for his physical safety or to console him for having lost another friend to gun violence. Therefore, at the end of the film, after their opening night performance, after Zeldes's camera pans from the stage to a proud Raynor standing in the audience, it is not surprising that Clark sentimentally concludes, as he has been miseducated to conclude, that you can't stop gun violence and that you just gotta have love. Please forgive me, but in the interest of social justice for Black people, I must rudely and unpoetically conclude that's bullshit. Thank you.
Thank you.
This is Marissa Greenberg, and it has been my honor to organize this panel and work with these amazing colleagues on these issues of teaching for social justice. We have a few minutes for Q&A, so please enter your questions into the chat. There will also be an opportunity for those whose schedules allow to enter a breakout room following this scheduled panel. But let's start with the Q&A. I will also welcome my fellow panelists if they have questions that they would like to pose. I know that we've been having some vigorous ongoing conversations ourselves about our papers, so I will invite you as well to join us.
Marissa, can you see the raised hand?
No, I cannot see the raised hand, interestingly.
And now there are some things in the chat.
Oh,
So there's somebody named Mariam who's got a hand raised.
The audio isn't activated though, so if you could enter your question into the chat, that would be very much appreciated. There have been a few questions here, and I'm gonna punt them to Elizabeth about the way caucusing works. Some more concrete details. Rachel Clark asked for, Erica Lynn asked about how it works in other contexts, including colleagues, and Holly Dugan asked about invisible identity affiliations, such as survivor, addiction, or mental health issues. So Elizabeth, would you mind speaking to one or more of those aspects of our caucusing pedagogy?
Sure, thanks everybody. Maybe I'll start with Holly's piece because it's so specific, and this question of invisible identity affiliations. And this was also something that Eric raised early on when we were reading each other's work, was what happens with folks who are biracial or who are non-binary, and you've set up a caucus that maybe involves a couple of options and folks don't feel like they quite fit. So I think there are a variety of ways of thinking about setting up caucusing. And one of the ways that, if you're interested in, if you see that there's some folks so we offer people the opportunity to tell us something about the ways in which they identify. And we include some really open-ended answers to that survey so that people can surface the things that are most important for them. So if being a survivor or an addict in recovery or working with a mental illness is something that is important to folks, hopefully it comes up in that. And I wonder if implicit in your question is then so you could build that into a caucus, and what that would involve in a way that's different from a caucus based on ethnicity is that there might be a kind of, you might be feeling like you're outing yourself in a way. A student might feel like they're outing themselves. And that is, one of my experiences working with lots and lots of trans students is that some folks are so relieved to be in a caucus with other trans students, and other folks who have the security of passing or who are still negotiating their identities feel less comfortable. So there really are affective differences between the way that different groups who are already marked in very visible ways versus groups that are not visibly. That question, and I think it's going to be that I would recommend talking with students about individually if that surfaces in their survey. And I don't want to take up too much time but I'll maybe put some other things in the chat.
Thank you. And yes, one of the challenges of a panel with 4 papers is sticking to the time. And I do realize that people's schedules are especially full. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to invite you to join us in the breakout room where we can continue to have conversation. And you should also feel free to reach out to any or all of us by email with any follow-ups about today's panel. Does that sound fair to my colleagues here? They're open to that? Kind of force that on you. All right, well, thank you again for joining us, and I hope that your schedules will allow you to join us in the breakout room.